All right, welcome to the Vineyard Politico podcast. We have a new interviewee coming in, Brian Maffly, the Salt Lake Tribune. Welcome. Brian, give a quick introduction of yourself real quick.
Yeah, Jake. Well, really, thank you for letting me, share my perspective with your listeners, your audience, and introduce myself. I'm a reporter at the Salt Lake Tribune. I moved here from California in 1994 to work for the Tribune, and last 10 years I've been writing about public lands, which is a pretty important aspect of life in Utah. Most of the state's public lands, and that includes places like Utah Lake. It's considered sovereign lands belonging to the state of Utah, and because of my beat, I became very interested in this proposal to dredge the bed of Utah Lake as a way to fix its, some of its ecological problems.
So how did it first present to you? Did you go out and find it, or did they approach you kind of with the story, or LRS?
Dude, it is like, this thing was completely off my radar. I mean, I've been writing about, stories about the efforts that the Army Corps of Engineers or the Bureau of Reclamation or Utah Department of Natural Resources was doing to kind of help get rid of invasive species, restore habitat, deal with the algal blooms on the lake. And then out of the blue, in it was probably late 2017 or early 2018, it was in front of the legislative session of 2018, the Parker brothers, Ben and Todd, who were kind of the original masterminds of the Utah Lake dredging project, came into our newsroom and unveiled this incredibly ambitious plan they had to dredge the lake and build thousands of acres of artificial islands. And they described this plan because they were looking to get support from the Tribune with their proposal before the legislature that session. And a reporter here named Courtney Tanner interviewed Ben and Todd. I can't remember which of the brothers. Ben was the engineering expert in this project. He actually had patents pending for this technology. And so Courtney did this story about it. At the time, she was covering the legislature. She's our education writer now. And I looked at this, like, we thought, my God, this is really, unlike anything we'd ever seen before. It seemed really far-fetched. And then lo and behold, it gets a lot of support from the legislature, and they passed a bill that session, essentially directing the Department of Natural Resources to consider projects like this, where a private player would come along, deal with confront these problems the lakes was having with algal blooms, invasive species. We know the gamut. And in exchange for that, there would be a land transfer. We would give them some of the bed of Utah Lake, which is quote unquote sovereign land of Utah, which, there's a lot of strings attached to how that type of land can be used. And so the Department of Natural Resources has this division called the Forestry, Fire, and State Land. So it became their responsibility to review this proposal. And there were, a dozen criteria at least that, this type of proposal needed to meet for a land transfer to occur. So it wasn't just, fixing the environmental problems at the lake, but creating new recreational opportunities, expanding the lake's water storage capacity, all sorts of just the kind of public benefits no one would ever argue about. We would all like these things to happen. But quickly critics came forward, and mostly, these were scientists at BYU, Brigham Young University, Utah Valley University, Utah State University, who are like scratching their heads like, wait a minute, dredging is a very problematic practice in terms of environmental impacts. We've seen all over the West, all over the world, where dredging and island creation has created a lot more problems than it fixes. And I was aware of that as from where I grew up in the Bay Area, Lake Tahoe, which is on the state line of Utah, Nevada. Dredging projects there, in the 60s and 70s had left, a huge legacy of environmental problems, especially at Lake Tahoe, which was this pristine mountain lake, which is incredibly deep. But there were dredging projects there, and in the pre-NEPA days, the days before the Clean Water Act and the National Environmental Policy Act, that really degraded the water quality of the lake. So here was this proposal to dredge, I think they were talking like 1 billion cubic yards of material from the bed of the lake as some way to fix it. So critics like, Ben Abbott, ecology professor at BYU, were quickly pointing out that, dredging the lake could potentially disrupt its kind of natural operation, its way of naturally regenerating itself. Anyway, the proposal, they kind of, went forward and trying to, get their permitting going. This was, so 4 or 5 years ago. And the Parkers kind of disappeared. Honestly, I thought their whole, by 2020, I thought the whole thing was kind of disappearing. The Parkers stopped returning phone calls. They, other than meeting with potential investors, they didn't seem to have much of a public presence. And then in 2021, the Parkers are out of the picture, and Ryan Benson took over as CEO with his brother John, taking an important leadership role, and they became very public in these efforts to raise money and raise awareness about what they thought would be the benefits of their dredging projects. And you saw these fancy billboards pop up along I-15 promoting this project. And then that's when we realized, oh, wait a minute, this is for real. And I really started ramping up kind of reporting on this project pretty aggressively. And so you saw the Salt Lake Tribune, and starting in 2021, we started really producing a lot of stories. There's been at least a dozen. I've shared them with you. I hope you can share them with your listeners, Jake. But through a lot of public records requests to various agencies, especially the EPA and the State Department of Natural Resources, we kind of started piecing together what they were really up to. And it became pretty clear that there were a lot of doubts about whether this project could accomplish what the Bensons and their experts say it would accomplish. Let me maybe have some questions before I.
Well, going to the public records request, was it just they weren't answering questions, or was it just there wasn't anything of public knowledge, or just you felt what inspired you to say, hey, I need to dig deeper on the public record side?
Well, we wanted to find out what the scientific basis for the company's called Lake Restoration Solutions, what the basis for their claims that deepening the lake by 7 feet will help reduce the nutrient loads and improve the water quality. In a nutshell, what the Bensons and the Parkers were saying was that, what they were going to do is, kind of dredge up these contaminated sediments on the bed of the lake, and then encapsulate them in these islands. In other words, so they would not be these contaminated sediments, which were nutrients and pollution from industry and agriculture and wastewater plants, would no longer be available in the water column. So with it out of the way, then there would be less nutrients to encourage those algal blooms that we see in the summer and fall that sometimes make the lake unfit to even swim in, or in, your dogs were getting poisoned, and that does happen. The algal blooms are probably the most visible problems associated with the lake. So we were like, well, what, who says that deepening the lake, that the average depth of the lake is 9 feet. So you're talking about adding another 7 feet. What evidence is there that would actually fix the water quality of the lake? And so we started sending public records requests to the Department of Natural Resources, asking them, what has this company submitted to back up these claims? And they basically got back to us and said, nothing. We don't have anything. We haven't even we have nothing. We have no basis for examining their proposal. It was just like, and so we were wondering, well, maybe they don't have anything. And then that's when these critics like Ben Abbott became very public with their concerns that there was no scientific basis for what Lake Restorations was saying, because they haven't publicly released any documentation yet. That, of course, led to this famous lawsuit by Lake Restoration Solutions against Ben Abbott earlier this year, or maybe it was last year. It's all kind of a blur now. But so it was kind of the criticisms that we were hearing from these scientists is what prompted me to really dig and dig and dig. And when I realized the state didn't have anything, that nothing had been submitted to the state, I began to wonder what's really going on here. And then we found out kind of serendipitously that Lake Restoration Solutions was trying to obtain, tens of millions of dollars of public financing through a program administered by the EPA, and it's called the Water Infrastructure Financing Innovation Act, WIFIA for short. And they, the Bensons had applied for funding in 2020, turned down again in 2021. And it was that WIFIA financing application is what you guys got interested in Vineyard, because Vineyard wound up, city officials wound up playing a kind of a pretty, hidden but important role in the Benson's efforts to get that financing. So I sent a, Freedom of Information Act request over a year ago to the EPA for everything Lake Restoration Solutions submitted supporting their application proposal. And which, 2020, I think they were seeking was a few $100 million. In the 2021 application, it was almost $900 million. I mean, it was a staggering amount of money.
Whoa, yeah.
Yeah. And so part of, we thought, well, if you're going to get the EPA on board on this, you need to put some evidence out there that what you're proposing is actually going to work. But also you need to show buy-in from local authorities, namely, the state of, in this case would be the state of Utah, and then potentially municipal entities in Utah County. So, but anyway, it took months for the EPA to comply with that, because because Lake Restoration Solutions had designated everything they submitted as "quote unquote" confidential business information. So because of that designation, it was not subject to public disclosure. So I challenged that, and I asked that the EPA do a formal review to determine whether it was legitimately classified as confidential and business information. It just dragged this request out for months. And finally, they did release hundreds of pages of documents, heavily redacted documents to me, that showed, that talked about, what the company was proposing, but ultimately didn't really shed a lot of light on what was going on because of the redactions. So, but the things that I thought interesting was how this company was raising money from outside sources for this project. It was expected to cost $6 billion. but supposedly none of it was going to be taxpayer money. Well,
That's what I was going to ask you. So like when it started, they came in kind of talking to you like, hey, private industry, private industry. When you finally got a hold of the Freedom of Information documents,
yeah.
did they finally change their tune, or was it just until you found the documents, it was like state money, vineyard money, and
Um,
with you line?
from the beginning, the way the Parkers had explained it to us, and the way the legislature was interpreting it, was the whole thing was going to be funded by the private sector. Private investors would provide the money, and through real estate development, the Lake Restoration Solutions would recoup its investment. Of course, that would lead to the development of commercial and residential development on these islands in the middle of the lake, and God knows what kind of impacts would come from that. That was the idea, and on paper, it just sounded all great. The taxpayers don't pay a penny, and these problems with the lake get solved. And hey, we are building all this great, desirable real estate in Utah County, which is, as everybody knows, is pretty much the fastest growing county in America right now.
Right.
Among, maybe probably in the top 5.
Right.
And
Nick,
it sound like it's like, well, it sounds like it's too good to be true. And when, when claims like that are being made, we need to take a hard look. And so the thing that really jumped out at me was the first look we got of what the project really was when they filed their permits with the Army Corps of Engineer. I guess that was early this year, early last year. Jake, can you remind me?
yeah. So yeah, it was early July of 2021.
Yeah.
January of 2021.
That's right, January 2021. And that's when I thought things got really interesting. Again, we had to go through FOIA to get that stuff as well. And again, hundreds of pages of documents were filed with the Army Corps of Engineers, which is a federal agency that regulates these type of projects that impact the quote unquote waters of the United States. And this would be probably one of the most extensive dredging projects ever undertaken in the United States. So but anyway, the proposal gets filed, the documentation, and lo and behold, the Army Corps of Engineers won't release it. And we again went through the Freedom of Information Act, and then after, I don't know, a month or two, they decided just to post a lot of this material on their website. So it became publicly available, for the most part, unredacted. And in there, we started seeing how Vineyard was going to be the launching pad for this whole proposal. And that was all news to us. They actually, for the first time, we saw a map of where these islands would be, and then that they would be phased. And phase 1 would be at the northeastern end of the lake. And it would basically be this, 2,000 or 3,000 acre string of islands off of Vineyard, kind of creating a lake within a lake. And then you'd have these, freeway-sized roads framing the town of Vineyard going onto this arcing island. And then this would be the first of 5 phases, moving, and they would basically move north to south as they develop this project. Well, that became really interesting because, Vineyard was one of when Lake Restoration Solutions had to show that these public entities had some kind of skin in the game. Well, Vineyard turned out to be one of those entities, according to the documents we got through our document request to the EPA. In there was, among other documents, was a letter that Mayor Fulmer, Julie Fulmer, signed on was September 2020 or something like that, indicating that the town of Vineyard had appropriated $5 million toward the project. Well, we have yet to figure out, well, how was that money appropriated? What was it to be used for? And in an email to me, Mayor Fulmer said, "Oh, well, that was $5 million that the redevelopment agency had set aside for lakeshore restoration work along Vineyard's lakefront." I don't really know if that's true or not, but the way it's described in the documents that the EPA has, it was more in the form of loan guarantees. That would be, presumably, to back up, to give some financial credibility to Lake Restoration Solutions while they're out there, looking for support from the investment community. And the other piece of that was $10 million in loan guarantees that the legislature authorized. So loan guarantees aren't the same as a loan. It's just an expression of support. This money may never even leave the town of Vineyard or the state of Utah. It would only, if in fact this money was obligated, the state and the town of Vineyard would only lose it if the loans went south.
Right.
It looks, and so again, I'm not clear at all. What is Vineyard's financial obligation here? I've gotten some mixed messages here, and I'd like to bring you into this conversation, Sean, like what you've been able to figure out during your own public records, adventures in this area.
Well, because so much was not turned over, the extent of what we found out is pretty much the extent of what at this point. There was a loan guarantee letter, how that came to be, what we knew about that letter, what the mayor knew about that letter when she signed the letter is still an unknown, because there's a magic letter. Jake called it the immaculate letter one time. That's exactly what it is. It's just this letter out of nowhere that really had no substantial information prior to or after that we've been able to get a hold of.
Would any council member or city manager go on the record? Did you reach out at all?
No, I have reached out to Mayor Fulmer. I have not heard from her. My bigger interest right now is like looking at how this project was able to go this far before it hit a dead end, as we saw last month when the Department of Natural Resources basically put an end to their review of the application. They were just basically, they concluded we don't have anything to review. Vineyard's involvement is part of that. That's where I think, where we are kind of turning our attention to as a news organization. But the part I really want to get to the bottom of is, was any public money ever obligated toward this project?
Right.
I think that's an important question. And part of my
I found this on the web for public money ever obligated.
Maybe the web.
I thought I was talking to her. we would like to get that figured out. At this point, it doesn't appear that a single dollar of state or local money was actually jeopardized in this project. I haven't seen any evidence of that. It looks to me, when you look at the letter that Mayor Fulmer wrote, there's some caveats in there. It's like, well, it's subject to the project, passing regulatory muster. I don't have the letter in front of me, but the way it's written to me, it suggests that that the money has not been released to any entity yet. and that's assuming that there really is a loan guarantee out there. Part of me wonders if this was just the town of Vineyard's effort to, give this project some credibility in front of the Environmental Protection Agency. Without buy-in from local governments, I just don't think the so-called WIFIA loan would stand a chance. Most of the applicants for this kind of money are actually, water districts and public entities that are doing a lot of its money used for sewer plant upgrades. And Salt Lake City, the year before, had obtained a WIFIA loan of like $350 million to do upgrades at their sewer plant in Salt Lake City to serve Salt Lake City. So, when you're competing with public entities, you can't just be, we're this, we're just trying to create a bunch of private islands here. We're here working hand in hand with public governments. That's the part, like, well, who are these governments that were supposedly backing this project? That's the part that is kind of a black hole to me.
So when you went and did grandma and answered these questions, so we recently Sean did a grandma. In fact, they changed the legislator and wouldn't even reveal the senator or someone, and said, oh, this is a bill, so therefore this is a draft. Did you find that common? Just a massive amount of redaction, a massive amount of having to go through legal to even find anything on your searches?
Yeah, for the FOIA stuff to the EPA, there was a lot of negotiating, a lot of phone calls, and at the end of the day, what we got was the truly interesting stuff. Really was redacted, like the kind of things, and it was all, again, it was considered proprietary information. But in terms of like the identities of people, it was hard to make a lot of sense from the documents we got from the EPA. Now from the state, we did get a lot of emails, the back and forth between the Governor's Office of Economic Development and these developers. And they had the names on there. The only things that were redacted were people's, phone numbers and addresses. And one of the things we were able to determine that there was GOED, the acronym for the Governor's Office of Economic Development, which has a new name now, by the way, called it goes by Go Utah. They had kind of gone to bat for these guys at Lake Restoration Solutions, meeting with potential financiers in New York, but mostly Wells Fargo, that was going to underwrite some of the bonds or whatever to make this project happen. So, we did have a lot of behind the scenes activity by, I think, people like Julie Fulmer, the State Office of Economic Development, certain members of the legislature helping push this project along. But at the end of the day, the Department of Natural Resources needed to have the documentation, the scientific basis that this project was actually going to result in a whole array of public and environmental benefits. And even though none of that evidence really never was put forward, this project still had a lot of wind in its sails, and the money to produce, to carry this thing as far as it did, with all the lawyers and all the billboards and all the, get-togethers with the legislature. Someone paid for that, and if it wasn't coming from the state of Utah, it was, I imagine, it was coming from the private investment community.
Right. A question: when you, I got a couple. When you looked into Vineyard, and Mayor wouldn't sit down for an interview or anything, and she sent you an email. I remember you probing the old city manager and trying to kind of understand like his involvement. And in the recent grandma, we tried to get the text messages between Mayor Fulmer and the city manager. something that I have read or has been read to me, because Mayor Fulmer has never publicly acknowledged that she knew about the loan.
Yeah. Well, you're calling it a loan. Is it a loan, or why are you characterizing it as a loan?
The loan guarantee. I mean, like
Yeah.
the loan in the text messages, it's talked about as a loan guarantee between the mayor and the previous city manager. So that's all the only reason why I characterize it. But in the letter, it's a loan guarantee. But then the EP, that's actually when we were before the grandma, they were like, are you talking about a loan or a grant? I'm like, I'm talking about a letter that these people use this word for before the EPA. So, but did you get anything?
No,
out of those?
Not really. I that is a big black box. And I think what I listened to the hearing for the most part that you and Sean had with the State Records Committee. It was spotty because there was this blizzard that day and my internet service kept going in and out. But from what I heard, what my takeaway from that was that whatever happened, proper records weren't kept of it. And so there really just wasn't much for the city of Vineyard to turn over. And I thought you and Sean raised some really great points that, hey, this is a project of just epic proportions that will have a huge impact on the town of Vineyard. Should there not be an extensive public process and document trail associated with this loan guarantee? And I guess the resounding answer from the town of Vineyard is no, there is no such records were taken. There were no meetings. And so consequently, there was not a whole lot to hand over in response to your record request. So that to me is what's interesting here, is that not so much that they didn't provide you the records you asked for. It's just that the records don't exist or weren't kept. Now, or maybe there is no loan guarantee and the whole thing is just make-believe. That's the other possibility here.
That LRS is writing it, but they're really actually well, and that's what we were trying to find, is like who's telling the truth. Is it LRS or on the other side? Culturally, though, so you've written for the Salt Lake Tribune for many, many years.
Yeah.
Are there stories that are this difficult to have so many documents redacted and so many moving parts? Is this a typical thing?
Jake, I hate to say this, but this is kind of par for the course. Before I was covering public lands, I covered the University of Utah and Utah State, and getting documents out of those, you think that those institutions would believe in transparency. It was very difficult then, and trying to get contracts they had with private entities, they always came back so redacted as to be why do I bother, and so I think what makes this so interesting is why I think this deserves the scrutiny it does is because there's this growing use of these so-called public-private partnerships to pursue these major infrastructure projects in Utah, whether it's that railroad proposed in the Uinta Basin to move oil out, or the gondola up Little Cottonwood Canyon, or this thing on Utah Lake, where it almost seems like we'll have this, it's a way to avoid public accountability and transparency to pursue these projects that will ultimately, and they also look like, the public is, assuming all the risks, and the private sector will be reaping the rewards. And so this is why I felt like the Utah Lake project it just sums up this kind of trend in Utah to use public money to support a private interest. And before the Utah Lake project, I mean, the biggest one of all was this proposed coal export terminal in the city of Oakland that was going to be built in part with Utah's mineral revenues. And like Utah Lake Project, it kind of got mired up in lawsuits and regulatory hangups, and but at the same time, it's like there's minimal transparency with how these things are conducted, and it's so that I think when my biggest complaint was that you as this company are proposing to get to basically re-engineer the biggest lake in Utah, freshwater lake in Utah, but then not explain where the money was coming from, what evidence you have that this is going to work. All these things that the public really needs to know in order to really know if it's the right thing to do. So, but clearly, if this was gonna work, someone was gonna be making a lot of money off of it. And I think at the end of the day, that I mean, it seems like there should be some lessons learned here. I just don't know what they are yet. But I don't know. I think what's happening here are sometimes people come forward in Utah with an idea that's going to fix some of these stubborn problems we have. And in this case, it was Utah Lake's really challenging environmental and ecological problems in a way that is painless. We don't need to make a lot. We don't need to raise taxes. We don't need to make a lot of demands on our governmental entities. It's the private sector is going to magically make it fix this problem. We just need to sign over some very precious resources over to them. In this case, it was the bed of Utah Lake, and after so much time, after 5 years, it's now apparent that there really wasn't a whole lot of substance to this proposal, and it's making me wonder, why it's consumed as much attention as it has. Whereas I think Professor Abbott's complaint was, hey, there are actual projects underway that are resulting in positive outcomes on Utah Lake. We're getting rid of the invasive Asian carp out of the lake. There's habitat restoration projects going on. The algal bloom situation has been improving in recent years because of upgrades to wastewater treatment plants. Through thoughtful investment, positive changes are occurring. Utah Lake's on a positive trajectory. Abbott's complaint was all that's being lost in the shuffle with all this attention on this big shiny object, which was the Utah Lake Restoration Project. And I think that's, but I think what Sean and Jake's interest here is like, Vineyard got swept up in this somehow, and you guys would like to get some answers about how that happened. And I hope you can get that sorted out. And I think the Vineyard City Council should step forward and say what really is going on with this $5 million loan guarantee. Yeah, and I want to back up for a second, Jake, to talk about some other documents we got, not through public records requests, they just showed up in our lap. So one of them is an investment deck that Lake Restoration Solutions and its financial partners were sharing with potential investors. And some of these folks, without me soliciting it, made these documents available to us, and in the way these PowerPoint decks explained it, the involvement was with Vineyard and the state of Utah was they had made financial commitments. On the Vineyard was a $5 million commitment, and the state of Utah $10 million commitment. In the grand scheme of things, that's peanuts. That won't pay for a month worth of dredging, but it did show a sign of it kind of created this, this appearance that the state of Utah and the town of Vineyard were partners on the project, when in fact they're not. If Vineyard were a partner on this project, I would think that the city council would have heard from the public on it and said so and passed a resolution where we support this project. These presentations were made to the investment community as a way to generate interest in investing. And I think
we know those presentations were made then. I mean, somebody presented it that way.
Yeah, I mean, it's in Lake Restoration Solutions' own documents. So I think that's why Vineyard's involvement is so important to the success of this project, because it helps create this appearance that you have at least one town on the shore of the lake signed up as a partner financially and politically, and this was happening at a time that the other cities, American Fork, Provo, Saratoga Springs, were going public with, reservations about this project. Is this, they were passing resolutions. I don't know if I would say they were opposing the project, but raising serious questions about whether this was the right thing. But then here's, the town of Vineyard was kind of an outlier there. Again, I don't know that your town city council has ever really publicly discussed its interest in this project, for or against. Do you know if it has, Jake?
But we know from Councilmember Chris Judd and Councilmember Nate Riley that this was never brought before them in the previous council. Julie had stated that it did, but then again, we went for grandma to show any public document and there's none. So it's like, two council members and against a mayor, and then everyone else has kind of stayed quiet, and it's just been these should be very easy answers. When all of this hit as a bombshell in February, they did hold a meeting when this kind of dropped and said, well, okay, what do we do? But they never really answered, like, to your question, what was the 2018 and 2020 letter, the two letters, how were these even produced, and how was this financial prospectus to go raise money? And if they were raising money in our name, how did that happen? So there's a lot of questions on that.
And to that, I mean, we've asked direct questions to previous and especially current administration, council members, mayor, everybody. Nobody will answer a direct question. They will say, well, let's set up a public meeting. We attempt to set up a public meeting, and that goes absolutely nowhere. So very, like Jake said, very simple questions like, what is this voted on? Should be a yes or no question.
Yeah.
They flat out refuse to answer the simplest of simple questions that you can think of.
Or how were the two letters sent? Did you send this in an email, or did you send this in your private email, or how these immaculate two letters, who sent it? I mean, we have a letter, and who did you send it to, so we could ask them questions, who at LRS received it, or even who at LRS is who's doing the sales presentation to get investors? Like, could we talk to them? Have they ever presented it? Just questions, just to whether you're, and that's why I always try and tell people, I don't think this is a pro-island LRS or anti-island. It's just trying to understand government process. And I think that's what your focus is it has morphed into. It's really not LRS. It's looking at this as a state as a whole, because there'll be another project. There'll be another attempt. Like when we get these public-private partnerships that say, hey, we're going to go through and do this, because they kind of turn to a private side, out of blue, no documents exist when you get into that. It's like, oh, I can redact this person can claim that this is private information. Yeah, it's money of ours, but
that's the frustrating part about these public-private partnerships, PPPs as they're called, because when you're looking for information, they can bury it as so-called confidential business information. That's my biggest complaint as a journalist. And with these, and now if it was the Department of Natural Resources trying to pull this project off, yeah, there would be a huge amount of documentation involved and a lot of opportunities for the public to weigh in and say, was this what we really want to see happen here? And that kind of, we never really got a chance to do that with the Lake Restoration Solutions project, but it looks like it's kind of running out of gas right now. So maybe it's all a moot point. So just to give your listeners an update, the company has petitioned Joel Ferry, the DNR director, to reconsider, his agency's rejection of their proposal. And they're, they're making their case that, in fact, that to back up a little bit, the reason why DNR's, rather the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, turned down this proposal was, one, they never received the necessary documentation to evaluate the proposal. But the other, deal killer was what's called the public trust doctrine. And they concluded, in consultation with the Attorney General's office, that what was being proposed here would run afoul of the state's public trust obligations for the way it manages the bed of the Utah Lake. And whenever the issue with what we call sovereign lands in Utah, according to the Constitution, is the land has to be, managed in a way to further certain types of public benefits and public use and navigation and things like that. And it dates back to, times of statehood when navigation was an important thing, getting from point A to point B. Now it's recreation is probably the more important aspect. And that's Lake Restoration Solutions' response is, oh, well, the idea of the public trust doctrine has evolved, and what we're proposing and what we're going to accomplish is going to be in accordance with the public trust doctrine. I think that that's a good faith argument. And I'm wondering if Director Ferry is considering that as we speak and may overrule the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands at the end of the day and, restart this review process. But that doesn't, you still have to submit your documents, your application, whatnot. It's been 5 years. You'd think that after 5 years, if you haven't, produced your documents yet, it makes me wonder whether it's ever going to happen.
How far you got? I'd like to ask a question on media, because I've actually had to learn quite a bit. Vineyard City almost has no citizens that attend our city council meeting, 3 or 4 people maybe a day. Yeah. And I think that's pretty common across most cities, how citizenry just are not engaged. And we've had the coming up of, social media, Facebook, Twitter, and everything that has really sucked a lot of the oxygen out. And the legacy media has really struggled with being able to continue, oversight. The media has always been a great oversight to government. But with the shrinking of media, one of the things that I think Sean and I came across with how complicated this was, wow, we need reporters.
Yeah.
And I kind of wanted to ask you that, because it's like we started this Vineyard Politico group because we were like, we don't support our local Daily Herald, Salt Lake Tribune, Deseret News. There's nobody to hold accountability. Maybe you could answer that question about how scary that we are in 2020 going into 2023. I feel terrified with how big these projects are.
Yeah.
Who's going to hold them accountable?
Yeah, well, it's not just, there's lots and lots of other projects out there that would deserve a lot more scrutiny than they're getting. And what's happened is, we all know, in the last 15 years, the news organizations in Utah, like every other state, pretty much have lost about half their staff, and in some cases they've gone out of business altogether. So we just don't have nearly the same number of people as we used to have to cover these. The Tribune used to have a staff of 150, maybe. We're not even half that today. And we have 4 photographers. We used to have 8. And so that means there's just less, fewer eyes on these important public entities to just keep an eye on what they're doing and inform the public. And I think what you've noticed about social media is kind of taking up the slack, and groups like yours to get the word out. But I think, had Deseret News and the Salt Lake Tribune and the Daily Herald had the much bigger staffs they had 20 years ago, I think there would have been reporters at some of these Vineyard City Council meetings. Instead, I don't think a reporter has ever attended a city council meeting. I go and listen to some of them after the fact, but we just don't have the time and resources to do that anymore. And I think it's helped push this level of apathy among the citizens of Utah who are, we're kind of in the dark. I think if people in Vineyard, had a good sense of what was at stake, I think more people would show up at those city council meetings. Like you said, it's still just a handful of people.
Right.
And that's, it's probably true of city council meetings all up and down the Wasatch Front. I know when Salt Lake City Council or Salt Lake County Council meets, if they have a hot button thing on their agenda, well, then there'll be a big turnout, when it has to do with, wearing masks at school or banning a particular book or something. Then, people come out of the woodwork to make their voices heard at these meetings. But then for the bread and butter stuff, it just seems like no one's paying attention.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of where when we were like, whoa, there's no record of any of this, like no emails, nothing. It was like, you mean over a 6-year period, we've never kept a public record of anything that's gone on within the city.
Well,
it kind of scared me. Like,
yeah,
John and I have full-time jobs. Everyone else that helps this project, kind of get to the end, we all have full-time jobs. In 2023, are we really supposed to be citizen journalists, or like we need to start funding a media, or there's got to be something that, and if there isn't, wow, we have to work together as citizenry to verify truth, verify documents, hold people accountable, especially on the city council. I mean, you made a great question. Like, city council has known about this for 10 months and they don't ask any public questions. Well, hey, let's have a public meeting. Let's get to the bottom of it type thing,
Yeah. I think the future of the news media is a pretty important issue here. And I think it's going to increasingly be turning toward, listener and reader support. And, the Salt Lake Tribune's kind of leading out in converting to a nonprofit classification, which has enabled us to, fund our operations with foundation money, philanthropic money, which would not be available if we were for profit. And it's also allowing us to make these appeals to the community for fundraising. I mean, we, like a lot of our subscribers, it's very, for our paper to survive and to grow, we need a lot more digital subscribers. We're at maybe 30,000 now to pay $8 or $9 a month. Some people, they pay a lot more than the $8 or $9 a month for their subscriptions. They're making a donation. And I think that's what's going to have to happen here. People are going to have to look at their news organizations as just something worth supporting, whether or not they read them.
Right.
It's the presence of KUER, our public radio station, KCPW, the Salt Lake Tribune, our competitor. I'm not going to name. I mean, we play a pretty important role that benefits democracy and the public. And I appreciate this opportunity to come on your program, Jake, to kind of make that appeal to your listeners.
The last question I have, and maybe people listening have a few, but where do we go from here? I mean, I think you heard in our grandma thing, it was they suggested this is out of our jurisdiction.
Yeah.
We do see a lack of no documents. We recommend, I would suggest you go to the state auditor and also the state attorney general.
Yeah, I heard that. Go to the attorney general. And I think at the end of the day, I think that's what you need to do is submit some kind of letter of concern or complaint with both, auditor's office and the AG's office. But at the end of the day, when I heard what they told you guys, it made me wonder if there truly was a loan guarantee extended to Lake Restoration Solutions. There would have to be a document there that would have come up in your grandma request, and that it didn't come up, that you know of. It makes me wonder if a loan guarantee was ever truly extended to Lake Restoration Solutions from the town of Vineyard.
Right. And then it also turns some investors been giving, someone's been paying for these billboards.
Yeah.
Been told that they're going to what kind of lawsuits are going to come out of that for, hey, you reported. I think that's kind of, I've had friends that have been taking advantage of people saying, hey, invest in this because this is surefire. The mayor backs it, the state backs it, and then out of the blue, it's a house of cards, and it's like, she might have sent a letter, but she's not talking, and that really wasn't the case.
Well, I mean, the investors, they had to be going into this with their eyes open, I hope. I don't know what's going to happen with them. I don't even know who they are. And if they ever want to share information with me, I'd be happy to hear what they have to say. I'm just, I'm not in a position to just call them up and say, hey, how do you feel about the project? But that's, I think, what might be the next step here is what's going to happen with those who put up millions of dollars to get this project going. Maybe they would, they might have some grievances here that are worth pursuing in the courts. I just don't know. But when we still haven't heard the final word from DNR too. I mean, this project might be alive and well. It's just, there just isn't enough information out there to know, but we do know that the EPA is currently not considering their application for, hundreds of $millions of public loans. And we also know that the Army Corps of Engineers has suspended their application review, as has the state of Utah. So it's looking like this project's hit a dead end at this point. But I'm not going to count it out yet. I think that the Bensons have seemed very determined from what I've seen from my interviews with them, with John Benson and Brian. I've spoken to them both. Very determined. They seem like they very much believe in the project. They clearly have political connections that are working in their favor. I'm not going to count this project out.
Well, I've seen people make careers out of knowing a project is going to fail. Milking this project for 10 or 12 or 15, 20 years, whatever it is, they'll make a career out of leveraging study money to see projects through, and whether they actually believe in them or not, I don't know if they even care, but they'll milk it as long as they can. And so you're right, this project's not going anywhere. It's going to be around for a long time. It's just going to change gears or names or strategy.
Well, Sean, I sure hope I can devote my attention to other things going on in Utah than this one. But I feel that it still needs a lot of attention going forward. And I really, my hat's off to you and Jake and and others, especially Ben Abbott, for really keeping this in the public's eye about what are the issues here. If it weren't for what you guys have done, I don't think people would really have appreciated or be even aware that Vineyard has this central role in this project. It can't be stated. I mean, it's almost become a kind of a linchpin in. I mean, it's the launch. I like to call it the launching pad of the lake restoration project.
And you said it early on, and it was perfect. I wrote it down: hidden but important role, and we have to start removing that hidden from what these cities and people are doing, because I think that they wanted this to remain hidden as long as possible, and they would have been totally fine with that.
Yeah.
Well, my last takeaway from the interview, and I really appreciate it. Like, I honestly never knew the value of media in getting into this story of like, wow, I think media should cover this. Well, there's no funds for media. Okay, well, let's continue to fight this and get this to the right channels. I just really appreciate you every month checking in and checking. We might have led the effort at the city level, but there's no way. I mean, when you broke the letter of Vineyard and sent it to us, we wouldn't be sitting here. We would all be quiet. No one would know. I mean, even currently to today, our mayor is still acting like this letter didn't exist, or both letters, or isn't even acknowledging, and so where would we be, and so that's kind of scary. And then the other thing is I'm hoping that our listeners will understand about these public-private partnerships. I hope there's a stigma that comes with, are my politicians engaging in a public-private partnership? Okay, if they're going to, are they going to allow for no public records? Are they going to allow their partner, a partner on the other side? And that was one thing that Julie said, I can't control a private company if they are controlling this. I would say, well, you can control to get in bed with them. You can control everything that I say with you is going to be on the record. Everything that I say with you is going to be in public meeting notes. We didn't get any text messages. We didn't get any, we got very, very little of in terms of emails back and forth with the Hartleys or the Bensons.
The Hartleys being Jeff and his brother, representing Lake Restoration Solutions before the legislature and in other capacities. Yeah.
And representing Vineyard. There are lobbyists as well at Vineyard City. So they represent both parties.
That's right. And that's another part of this. It really has not been reported on, or the role of the Hartleys. There's all these brothers, sets of brothers in the Utah Lake story. And that's, another issue. Yeah. So, well, I really appreciate this opportunity. Guys, I hope I get another chance to visit with you guys again, and we'll be doing more scrutiny of the Utah Lake project.
Thanks so much. Does anybody have any questions that's listening in? If anyone has any questions, we'll end it there. But thanks, guys, and appreciate it. Honestly, Brian, I'm gonna add in the post a link to all of Brian's stories that he's written throughout the years. And also just supporting, I can't tell you, we've had quite a few reporters come in every couple months, and they're so confused about because it's such a complicated story. I mean, there's just so many moving parts, and partners can throw you in one direction or one to another, and look over here.
Yeah, this is not a story where a reporter can kind of parachute in and do some good reporting here. It takes people who've been following it from the beginning. And I hate to say it, and I've been one of those reporters who's been following this from the beginning. But I do think this, I think it deserves the attention that the Tribune and other publications have given it. But sometimes, as you notice, these kind of quick hit stories, they just don't make a whole lot of sense. And I'm not faulting the reporters. If I were if I had just jumped into this story for the first time, I would not be able to make sense of Mayor Fulmer's involvement. It would just seem, oh yeah, big deal. So she wrote a letter. There's just so much context you need to have to make it make any sense at all.
We got Josh. Josh just asked a question. He says, I've always seen the mayor being involved as conflict of interest. Do you have an opinion on that? I think to add that to context, it's that in the last 3 months, she has tried and been successful at becoming the Lake Authority chair. That would be over that.
Yeah, the conflicts of interest are a really tricky thing, and I don't like to accuse anybody of a conflict. Here, where there's a potential for one is as the mayor of Vineyard, and then as a and then there's no conflict there. But if then she, Julie Fulmer is also a booster for this project in some other capacity. Well, then that's where a conflict might emerge. Now, I don't have any knowledge about that at all. So I'm not going to hazard a guess whether she's got or anybody else for that matter has a conflict of interest associated with this project. But that said, there's so little transparency about Lake Restoration Solutions. We just don't know. How involved certain people are in, financially or politically or whatever with this project. We just, like you said, you were getting documents provided where the legislator's name was blacked out. So we just don't really know.
Yeah. Okay. Great question, Josh. All right, guys. Thanks for coming in. We'll put this
That's
on.
super helpful. Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, Sean, it's really good to meet you, and you guys have a really great new year.
Appreciate it. Thanks, guys.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.